Thank you for joining our presentation today on Ask the Heart Doctor. Our topic today will be heart healthy eating. My name is Mari, and I work in community health at Baptist Health South Florida. This presentation is webinar style, so if you have any questions, please use the chat box or our Q&A box. Baptist Health offers a variety of free virtual exercise classes and programs, and for our weekly schedule, please visit our website at events.baptisthealth.net. I'll also put that in the chat box for you. With that being said, I would like to now welcome our speaker today, Dr. Feldman. Welcome, Dr. Feldman.
Thank you, Maury. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm actually very excited to hear the talk today because it's going to be led by one of our leading dietitians in Baptist Health, Lucette Talamas, who's going to talk to us about heart healthy eating, and then we'll leave time at the end for what we hope to be a very exciting discussion. But probably there's no lifestyle factor that matters more than what we put in our body. I'm reminded of the Warren Buffett story where he told everyone at the Columbia Business School where he graduated. And for those who don't know Warren Buffett, he's one of the 2 or 3 wealthiest men in the world. He said, I'm going to give everyone a car and who graduates from Columbia Business School, but you only get one car in your lifetime and you have to take care of it. And then, of course, he said, well, just kidding. What I really meant is you only get one body in your lifetime, and you better make sure that you put good gas in the engine, meaning good food and fuel in the tank. And we know that, you are what you eat. And when it comes to preventing cardiovascular disease, there's probably no area of medicine in which that's more important. So I look forward to, with great enthusiasm, a really wonderful talk that you're about to hear by Lucette Talamas. So Lucette, I'm going to turn it over to you, and hopefully we'll leave some time at the end for some discussions and questions.
Sounds good. Let me get on here. Okay. So thanks for having me join your doc talk today, and for that wonderful intro. It's always great to hear other healthcare professionals advocate for nutrition, not just the dietitian. So let me pull up my slides. You give me 1 second to share my screen. So today's topic is all about heart healthy eating. And there we go. So there's a lot to say on nutrition and heart health. So I'm so glad to be able to cover this because then we can also hear from Dr. Feldman a little bit more about the medical side of heart health and some of the nutrition recommendations that may go along with it too. So some of the general recommendations we're going to focus on today are replacing saturated fats with replacing your saturated fats with unsaturated fats. So we're going to talk more about fats and sodium, which are the 2 basic nutrients. Again, there's a lot more to cover in general, but this is probably the most important in our time today to talk about the effects of the dietary fats and your blood cholesterol, and then the effects of sodium on blood pressure. And the hardest part with nutrition is knowing how you can apply this to yourself. So one thing is to understand, and the second thing would be how can you apply this message today. So, and then we'll conclude talking a little bit about fiber. So as we're talking about nutrition and heart health, we can't skip talking about, or start off by talking about the Mediterranean diet. So the Mediterranean diet is actually not a set diet. Well, I know it sounds confusing because it's called the Mediterranean diet. It's actually a dietary pattern. So I see some familiar names that are joining me today. So you've heard me talk about dietary patterns, which, it just means what are the foods that you're eating more often, and what are foods that you are eating less often. So the Mediterranean diet pattern has foods that are higher in abundance compared to other foods. And I really like the flexibility that, the true Mediterranean diet pattern has. If you think about it, the Mediterranean diet, it's a collection of eating patterns from all the different countries that surround the Mediterranean Sea. So there's a lot of different countries and different cultures and lifestyle, like you see at the bottom of the pyramid. So we'll start looking at the pyramid. And you'll notice that the base of the pyramid starts with lifestyle. So it's also to say that, part of heart health and prevention and management of any chronic disease, nutrition is really important, but so is overall lifestyle. So you see, people being physically active, enjoying your meals, like actually stopping and eating your meals versus eating in a rush and things like that. And also being socially engaged. So meal times are also social times and so on. So as we move up to the largest part of the pyramid to describe what are those foods that are most abundant in the Mediterranean eating pattern, it's basically all of your plant-based foods. So your fruits, your vegetables, your grains, mostly whole grain, beans, nuts, seeds, legumes, herbs, spices, and vegetable oils, specifically olive oil. So the base of the Mediterranean eating pattern is basically the vegan diet. Now, that should not alarm you or scare you. It does not mean that you have to be a vegan in order to have a heart healthy diet. It just means everyone can strive to have more plant-based foods as part of their larger, the foods that they're choosing in larger, more frequent quantities compared to the other foods. So as we go up the pyramid, we see our animal foods, starting with fish and seafood. Then we see our poultry, eggs, cheese, yogurt. And at the very top, we see red meat and sweets. So, that can be applied in two different ways as far as the frequency and also the portion size of the meats and sweets that you may have in your diet. So notice that, it's not really about eliminating a certain food, but it definitely is more about playing with the portion and also maybe the frequency that you have that food. So, the base of the pyramid should be what we go for every day. And then as we go up the pyramid, animal protein, it's mostly seen, this is a big shift in what we're used to for sure. But the shift in the animal protein is that we see it more like a topping versus as a side dish versus as the main entree. So often we say, like, what's for dinner? We'll say chicken, right? So the reverse might be, we're having rice and beans with a side of chicken. So sometimes it doesn't really mean changing what you eat. It might mean changing the portions of what you're eating. So I'll leave you with that concept about the Mediterranean diet. An easy visual to apply the Mediterranean diet is through the plate method. So you've seen this before if you've heard any of our dietitian nutrition talks on here. And again, the science behind the My Plate is actually several eating patterns, which one of them is the Mediterranean diet. It was some of the evidence used to create the My Plate. And you see the same message. So the My Plate shows us the 5 food groups that have always been around in nutrition. I mean, these are the same 5 food groups that don't change. Now, different diets and dieting, address these food groups and alter them, sometimes too much. That's why it's always about finding a healthy eating pattern that's sustainable for yourself for the rest of your life. And in this pattern, we see more fruits, vegetables, grains. Notice those 3 out of the 5 food groups are, especially if you just look at the plate itself, 3 of the 4 food groups, or 75% of your plate, is plant-based. And this is just for general healthy eating. This is the plate that we call general healthy eating. But nowadays, with so many diets and trends, people look for, trying different, they're just titles. If we say plant-based, if we say vegan, vegetarian, the goal is just to have a healthy eating style. And as described by the My Plate and the Mediterranean diet, it means, choosing more of the plant-based foods. So realistically, when you look at your plate, what you'll notice is half the plate will open up to be vegetables. That's more of a realistic portion. The fruit can be off to the side, like something sweet after your meals. And then the other half of your plate is protein, which can include all of the above, right? The plant-based and the animal. But notice how, the plate portion is about 25%, which is still the same old recommendation of 3 to 5 ounces per sitting at one meal. And then at the bottom right, we see the whole grains. So, that means, yes, eating your carbs. There's many diets out there that either attack carbs, make them seem like they're really bad for us. And it's just about choosing the right quality carbohydrate and also the right amount. So I do hope to see carbohydrates present at meal times. And notice it takes about 25% of your plate. Portion wise, that's anywhere from a half cup to 1 cup of cooked carbohydrate. It also includes your starchy vegetables, for example, not just your grains. That would all fit on that 25% of your plate. So those were just general overview of nutrition recommendations. If you have any questions also during our time today, feel free to ask in the chat or the Q&A. So we'll be happy to take some of your questions as well. And now we'll get into specific heart health topics, right? So now that we laid down the ground of what a general healthy eating style is, now we talk about the specific types of fats. So fat, if you notice, was not a food group necessarily, but fat is definitely one of the 3 main macronutrients that supply our body with energy, and also a lot of other things. That fat is really important in the diet. So carbs have been attacked at one point. Fats have also been attacked by all of the popular diets. The truth is we do need all 3. We need carbs, protein, and fats. Now, when it comes to fats, what we need to pay attention to is the type of fat. So fats can mainly be categorized into unsaturated fats, like you see on the left. Those are the ones we love. Then we want to limit our saturated fats, and then lose our trans fats, which, sorry, I'll be explaining a little bit why the FDA has made that a little easier for us. So we're really going to focus on those saturated fats now. Now, the important thing about a heart healthy eating pattern is, which I've seen this information be confused by some patients, it's not just focusing on your unsaturated fats that I'm about to cover. We want you to choose more of those, but you can't just start choosing more of those without getting rid or decreasing. It's impossible to completely get rid of all the saturated fat, but at least decrease the saturated fat sources. So I like to give a quick example of, a visual, right? So if you're having a sandwich, and usually put 2 or 3 slices of cheese, if you're a cheese lover. Now, cheese is a source of saturated fat. It's also a great source of calcium, so again, there's no need to necessarily eliminate it completely, but we do need to watch our portion size. So if you're adding 2 or 3 slices of cheese, you can definitely reduce that to 1 slice, for example, and then add a sliver of avocado, okay? Or you can completely, even just try using avocado in the sandwich instead of cheese. So notice how you didn't just add avocado to your sandwich because it's good for your heart, and you kept the 3 slices of cheese in there. The idea is to replace. So as you decrease your saturated fat, you can start increasing your unsaturated fat sources. So let's talk a little bit more about these. Okay, so which ones are your unsaturated fat sources that are great for your heart? That is your fatty fish. So salmon, tuna, sardines are the most common ones. Herring is another one, mackerel. These are lake trout. These are different types of fish, but for sure, salmon, tuna, and sardines are the most common, convenient ones. Be nutty, so going for any type of nut or seed. Nuts and seeds, again, people sometimes ask which one's better. They all have their health properties. The difference between a pistachio, an almond, and a cashew. At the end of the day, they're all great sources of unsaturated fats and vitamins, minerals. The thing is, with all of your healthy fats, as I go down the list, avocado, and then also any type of vegetable oil, except coconut oil, which we can talk a little bit about during our discussion maybe. But all of these 4 main sources of unsaturated fats, although they're all good for us, we still need to be very mindful of the portion size. Okay, so just because nuts are good doesn't mean you can eat straight out of the nut jar, because easily when we're mindless, you can eat half a container in one sitting without realizing it. Now, these are still fats at the end of the day, and they contribute a lot of calories. That's just how fat the macronutrient fats are. It's the densest macronutrient, so compared to protein and carbs. So it just means we need to be more mindful about our portion sizes. So all of these are measured by the tablespoons. Well, I should say the nuts, the seeds, like the butters are measured by 1 or 2 tablespoons. If you're eating, any type of nut, it would be 1/4 of a cup as a 1 serving. If you're using seeds like sunflower seeds, I know some people love adding those to like salads, for example, which is great. But if you're adding too many, 1 tablespoon usually has like 100 some calories. So it's just being mindful. Also with our oils, 1 tablespoon of any oil or even butter has 120 calories. So it's really easy to over pour without being mindful of our portions. Okay. So a little bit more about the fatty fish. American Heart Association recommends eating fatty fish twice a week in order to get all the omega-3 fatty acids that you need, as far as someone that's just looking to follow a general healthy eating lifestyle. Again, this isn't in regards to omega-3 supplements. This is about that healthy diet and, to maintain heart health, and and just general health as well. So omega-3s are they're actually, it's a very popular word, right? People are like, oh, my omega-3s, but the actual official word is omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids. So it goes with the trend that we're talking about of unsaturated fats. They're all very beneficial. One type of unsaturated fat is your omega-3s. So fatty fish is a great source of omega-3s. You don't need a lot of it, so it's almost about 4 ounces twice a week. 4 ounces is the size of like a deck of cards or the palm of your hand. It's not a huge piece. Most restaurants probably serve closer to an 8-ounce piece of salmon, if you do get salmon like at restaurants, for example. So just know that, by including it in part of your meal planning twice a week, that's one heart healthy recommendation. Get omega-3 in the EPA and DHA form. Now, there are plant-based sources of omega-3, but our body does not convert it as readily into the usable form. So for example, walnuts and flax seeds are known to have the plant-based omega-3, but it's in the ALA form, which has to be converted, and that conversion rate is usually not very high in most humans. So while again, it doesn't mean that it's bad. It's always best to get your omega-3s from fatty fish. So hopefully you like fish. If not, we can talk about it. Saturated fat. Okay, so we talked about your unsaturated fats. Now the saturated fats, what's the issue? So a higher intake of saturated fat is associated with increased total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol. So I always like to remember LDL cholesterol, like L is, you want the L lower. So it's not a good thing that saturated fat can help, that saturated fat increases your LDL. We want to, if anything, obviously have that number be lower. So it's challenging to limit the amount of saturated fat because of just the American diet that we typically have. So saturated fats are mostly found in 2 main large categories, and that's your animal foods, animal products. So anything that comes from cow, pork, chicken, as well as their products, so milk, for example. But then each of these categories also have lean or low fat versions, which we can talk about a little bit in label reading. And then processed foods. So processed foods can be high in saturated fats because they use the different types of oils that are used. Some of them are hydrogenated oils, which is another word for saturated fat, basically. And then also palm oil, which is like another type of tropical oil that's high in saturated fat. Coconut oil is also very high in saturated fat. While it has a beneficial property to it, it does have a beneficial, it's the MCT oil that's a part of the coconut oil. It still coexists with harmful saturated fats. So at the end of the day, the American Heart Association and other nutrition organizations do not recommend the consumption of coconut oil. So we can talk a little bit more about that too at the end. So to stick to the topic now, saturated fat, animal foods, and processed foods. So we need to watch out, which I'll show you in a little bit how to watch out for it on a nutrition label. Next, dietary cholesterol. So I'm using the words dietary versus blood. So dietary cholesterol, the question is how much and does it truly impact our body cholesterol? So I focused a lot on the saturated fat because that's the first line, I guess, or, the first thing you want to do when you're trying to manage your cholesterol levels is to look at the saturated fat that you consume throughout the day in common products that you eat and choose throughout the day and throughout your week. The second approach could be looking at cholesterol. However, there's a lot of, I think, controversy with the topic of dietary cholesterol because just because you eat the dietary cholesterol, does that mean that will impact your blood cholesterol as much as we may think? So saturated fats has been the nutrient to focus on the most. And that's usually what I like to recommend, as far as a nutrition approach to managing cholesterol. Your blood cholesterol is starting with saturated fats. Now, your blood cholesterol comes from two sources. So your body produces cholesterol and manages the production of cholesterol and how your body gets rid of it. And then the other 25% is from the food. So food is still important for sure. But that's why it's so important to always work with your physician, your cardiologist, to figure out, the best way to manage your blood cholesterol, because your body plays a big role in just how your body, produces and absorbs cholesterol in general. Okay. So cholesterol has been very controversial, especially with the egg. So I like to talk about the egg, the most controversial food probably in heart health. And the question, like these Time magazine covers, do we eat the egg? Do we not? It always seems to be a trending headline that's very confusing. So the poor egg has gotten so much bad attention. And the truth is, at the end of the day, can we eat eggs? The answer is yes, we can, but how much it depends. Usually we look at the egg in a very simple form of we associate the egg with cholesterol and that's it. And the truth is that when you look at eggs, they're a great source of protein. They're one of the few sources of vitamin D. Vitamin D is not found in many foods. They're a great source of lutein, which is an important mineral. It's an important vitamin for your eyes, and also vitamin B12. So there's many other nutrition components to the egg. As far as for your cholesterol levels, the bigger question is more about what do you eat your eggs with? So reducing, to say that someone has high cholesterol and just attacking the egg is almost not fair, because we have to observe what you're eating throughout the day. That's why we'll say it depends how many eggs you can have, because if you have a lot of other sources of high saturated fat in your diet, for example, the Time magazine cover on the left has a slice of bacon. So if you're eating your eggs with bacon and you fry them in butter, and you have other sources of saturated fat, then can we really blame the egg, or what about the side dishes that you're eating the eggs with? Now on the other side, we see the egg with avocado. Maybe you're eating your eggs with whole grains. So it depends at the end of the day how much saturated fat you have in your diet. There's no clear-cut answer to just give everyone. There's a lot of research on it to show sometimes that even one egg a day for most people seems to be okay. But at the end of the day, nutrition is also individualized. So the answer is it depends. It depends on what else you eat throughout your day to determine how many eggs you can eat per day. Okay. So a quick crash course on label reading on saturated fat. So I mentioned that saturated fat is present in a lot of processed foods. So the only way to analyze a processed food is by reading the nutrition facts label. If it comes in a box, a can, a jar, it's always best to flip it, find that nutrition facts label, because a lot of times there's great marketing companies that make the products look healthy. but you always want to just read the nutrition facts label to analyze. So the quick crash course of just analyzing the saturated fat. Remember, fat is an important part of the diet, but we need to watch out for the type of fat that you have in your diet. So we want to keep saturated fat low. So how can we do that? We start off by looking at the serving size, because you always want to know what is the amount that we're analyzing. So this is actually a nutrition label for whole milk. So this is for a cup of whole milk. And notice that the saturated fat has 5 grams. So this is the crash course right now on how to understand a nutrition label. So if it's around 5%, we're actually not going to look at the grams. We're going to look at the percent daily value. If it's around 5%, 5% means it's low. So in the case of saturated fat, that's a good thing if it's around 5%. If it's around 20%, it means it's high. Now, these two numbers, 5% and 20%, it's applicable for the whole label. So, for example, this is milk. In the case of calcium, we see 20% calcium per cup of milk. That's a good thing, right? Because the 20% means it's high in calcium. Now, the saturated fat is 25%. So that's obviously exceeding the 20% value, which means 1 cup of whole milk is very high in saturated fat. Now, if I were to show you a low-fat milk, I already have those memorized for you, but 1% milk is about 8% daily value, which means that it's low in saturated fat. Okay, so that's your crash course on looking at the amount of saturated fat on a nutrition facts label and how to make sense of your numbers. You, instead of looking at the grams and milligrams, just look at the percent daily value. The idea is that if you keep choosing more products that are low in saturated fat, it's hard to reach a high saturated fat diet if you're choosing consistently lower saturated fat products. That's the theory behind it. Now, avoiding trans fats has gotten a lot easier because the FDA has banned them from our foods. Now, trans fats are man-made fats. We can say they're produced in manufacturing. They were horrible for our cholesterol levels. And scientifically, the name of a trans fat in an ingredient list is partially hydrogenated oil. So those are the words that are highlighted below. If a product had a partially hydrogenated vegetable oil listed as an ingredient, it was a source of trans fat. So I used to talk about this in a lot more detail, but since the FDA has basically banned it from all of our food in America, so if you actually do buy food that are imported, you might still have to check the label for trans fats. It used to be very high in sweets, so like any type of baked good, margarine, spreads, coffee creamers, I found were a huge trap for many people who drank a lot of coffee and used a lot of creamer that had partially hydrogenated oils. But those companies have now, especially the creamers, they've reformulated it. So it doesn't mean it doesn't have saturated fat. It might now have saturated fat, but at least it doesn't have trans fat. So it always comes down to label reading. So we'll take a break from talking about fats and I'll quickly talk about sodium. The importance of watching out for sodium in your diet is because while the body needs sodium to function, when you have too much sodium, it can directly impact your blood pressure. And when you have high blood pressure, that's a major risk factor for heart disease and stroke. So one thing leads to another, right? And in the case of diet and sodium, the idea is to aim for less than 2,300 milligrams per day. The American Heart Association has a much more conservative number. They recommend 1,500 milligrams of sodium per day, especially for those that have been diagnosed with high blood pressure or are at risk of high blood pressure, like if it runs in your family. To put it into a visual, 2,300 milligrams is 1 teaspoon of sodium. So I think the most common thing I hear is, well, I don't use the salt shaker. And people assume if I don't use the salt shaker, I must follow a low sodium diet. And unfortunately, like you see in this graph, the salt shaker contributes maybe somewhere between about 10%, like you see on the far left. It's either added during food prep or added at the table, but the total is about 10% of sodium comes from the salt shaker. So just because you got rid of the salt shaker doesn't really mean anything because 70 to, there's also estimates as much as like 75 or 80% of our sodium in our diets comes from processed foods and restaurant foods. So we all know that we pick up food, we don't always have time to cook. So that's where all the sodium is usually coming from. The processed packaged canned foods, even if it's labeled organic, sometimes these foods are, sometimes that's why I said always look at the nutrition facts label, because words like natural and organic can throw you off, but the nutrition facts label will not lie to you. So watching out for processed foods and restaurant foods is really key. These are just some examples of, some frozen meals, canned soup, basically any type of soup though, even if it comes in a box or from a restaurant. Soups tend to be very high, unless you're making it from scratch at home. But soups tend to be very high in sodium. Chinese food is a really tough one because Chinese food is usually very high in sodium. And like you see there, 1 tablespoon of soy sauce can have 1,000 milligrams of sodium, which is, 2/3 of your daily recommendation from just 1 tablespoon or about 1 packet of soy sauce. Also, low sodium soy sauce is still very high in sodium, even though it's low sodium. It has less than the original, but it still is very high. And then obviously any type of restaurant food, fast food, they're all very high sources of sodium. So when it comes to label reading, remember the rule: if it's closer to 5%, it's low. If it's closer to 20%, it's high. So the same applies for sodium. If it's 20%, it's high. You also can maybe remember the numbers. If you're aiming for 1,500 milligrams a day, this product pretty much meets 1/3 of your daily sodium intake. So the good news is, if you do a little searching, you can definitely find products. So the same manufacturer usually has a no salt added or a low sodium version. So, sometimes it takes a little time to do that extra research in the grocery store, but it's always worth it if you can pick up the low sodium version. And then it doesn't mean, you can't add a little salt. It's always better to buy no salt added or low sodium, and then you can add a little bit of the salt at home if you need it. But that way you're not buying something completely loaded and very high in sodium. So that wraps up talking about mainly the fats and sodium. I really wanted to make sure to get through those. Fiber, there's a lot more to talk about with heart health. Fiber is another one of those nutrients. If you're following a Mediterranean-like eating pattern, or the My Plate pattern, choosing less processed foods, whole grains, fruits, and vegetables. So many times we think, yes, our vegetables have fiber, but the highest portion of fiber is actually found in your whole grains. So again, when people tell me that they're not eating carbs, that really concerns me, because it's hard to get in a good amount of fiber if you're not eating your carbs from the right sources, of course. So your whole grains, your brown rice, your quinoa, whole grain pasta, your starchy vegetables like sweet potatoes, and of course your fruits and your vegetables, they all have your fiber. So it's actually easy to get the 25 grams that are recommended each day. Fiber is like really strongly associated with, having decreased heart disease in general. So that's why it's important, if you're just choosing more of your whole unprocessed foods, it's very likely that you can get the 25 grams. But most Americans are not getting the minimum amount. So I'll leave it with that so we can get into some discussions on what we just talked about. So.
Well, Lucette, thank you very, very much. That was excellent. Obviously, a ton of information. Maury, are you getting any questions from the audience? Because it's not coming to me.
Yes, so we do have a question. Everything I have read finds that dairy causes inflammation. Meat and sugars cause cancer. I find it interesting that yesterday they talked about in the news that red wine and cheese are good for dementia. So basically they wanted to know, what are your thoughts on all of these mixed messages?
Dr. Feldman, do you want to start that
Yeah,
off?
I think, well, it was sort of what I was going to lead with the question there is, you know, in the nutritional space, as we know, there's a ton of great science in nutrition, but when you look at nutritional studies as it relates to disease, it's extremely difficult to control for a single nutrient or type of food, and then look at all of the other confounding or co-founding variables that exist between a particular food and dementia. I mean, there are thousands of, of points along the way that it's not a straight line. And here we're looking at the, you know, basically surveys of people's recollection of how much they have of something compared to something else, look at large populations and see small population-based differences and say this is good for that and this is bad for that. And thereby, it's not as if we're not trying to do right by that, but if you literally followed, and the egg, I mean, I've been following the egg issue for 40 or 50 years, being someone who has been an egg lover and a good source of protein, and in lots of different weight loss diets, a very powerful way to suppress that insulin drive towards glycemia. But you can't, you know, if you just looked every decade, eggs are good for you, eggs are bad for you, eggs are good for you, eggs are bad for you. It becomes very, very difficult to know. So, I mean, I think the point that I would make about all of this is, and again, there's a ton of good science when it comes to heart healthy eating and nutrition as it relates to overall health, but it's really much more what Lucette tried to share with you at the beginning. It's more principles of eating and patterns of eating and incorporating healthy eating in terms of an overall lifestyle of a general approach to health, with regular exercise and weight management and not smoking and moderating alcohol and caffeine, and finding that mix and managing your stress so you don't become a stress overeater and then have obesity and diabetes as the problem. So I would, there are very few magic foods. I think you would agree with me, Lucette. There are certainly many very bad foods, and that's really where I think the general concept of eating whole, non-processed foods, which is what you led with, which is not the specific Mediterranean diet, but the pattern of what the Mediterranean diet offers. And thereby, I would pay much less attention to this being good for this week and this being bad for that next week, because you'll drive yourself crazy and there's no right or wrong way. I think that over time, we have certain principles. Trans fats are bad. High fructose corn syrups are bad. Processed foods have a ton of salt, ton of berry sugar, even though they're meant to make you feel like you're eating healthy, they're not. And thereby, I would focus much more on the principles of healthy eating, whole non-processed foods in moderation, what we learned in kindergarten, the old moderation, variety, and balance, and not be so prescriptive that you must eat this and you can't eat that. And that's been my general approach. And I think with that as a lead-in, Lucette, the question I want to ask you, and I sort of primed you in our preliminary yesterday, is this nutritional stuff is really complicated. I mean, I've been studying nutritional science for 40 plus years, and it's very hard for me, and I believe I have some real expertise in this field to really sort it out. So what I would ask you, and this is the challenge that I have as I see these patients every 15 minutes all day and all week, is if you can give me your 30 to 60 second general overview summary about what you would lead with for someone, the typical patient that I see with cardiometabolic disease, someone who's overweight or mildly obese, has mild hypertension, some degree of dyslipidemia with hypertriglyceridemia, a borderline elevated blood sugar with an A1C between 5.7 and 6.5, so a pre-diabetic, who's working hard, working 12 hours a day, not getting enough exercise, told you they were a former athlete, and they say, doc, or, dietitian, tell me, give me, I don't want to say 25 words or less, but give me your 3 most important principles that will help guide me between now and the next visit, where I will be happy and you will be happy with where that leads me. That's a way long winded question to what I'm sort of forcing into a relatively short answer, but I've prepared you for where I want you to go.
You did. And my simple answer would be consult with a dietitian. It's
Okay.
30 seconds, I think the general principles, but I think when it comes to nutrition, there's 2 sides. There's education, which is, I think, what you're asking, like what's something I can provide that will inform them, that may change their lives, right? But I feel like we do have informed audiences, right? And don't get me wrong, it's also confusing. People think they know because of a certain study, and then it's actually maybe not the best information. But there's the education side, and then there's the counseling side. And with the counseling side, it's why it's behavior change. So in order to see the A1C and lipids and the blood chemical things change, it's the effect of long-term behavior changes. So that's why I say, like, if it's the person is really stuck at that point, I would say nutrition counseling is sitting an hour. The truth is, there's so many factors that we would have to figure out, if it's education or behavior or both. Often it's both, that the patient might need more of. So the basic principles, you and I, we already know, the eating less processed foods, eating more vegetables with your meals, but watching your carbohydrates. But these are very simple topics that have a lot of depth. And so many times people are like, they'd say, I'm eating healthy. And that the same two people that say they're eating healthy can have radically different eating styles, right? So that's why I would say, I think at the end of the day, consulting with a dietitian to really understand like what they mean by eating healthy. And
let me I guess ask it this way, and this is something that's sort of a strategy that I've used when people just are overwhelmed, and this can be overwhelming even for those who are very thoughtful and insightful and knowledgeable. I've taken the approach of asking someone to self-assess their own nutritional rating. I don't get into what their baseline level of knowledge is, but let's assume it's an average adult 50-year-old's baseline level of knowledge and nutrition. I generally tend to ask people to self-assess, granted that you may self-assess at an A and the same person with a diet may self-assess at a B or a C. But I generally ask people to sort of lean into, if you had to recognize one major factor that in your diet that you wish you could change, or that you recognize might be, and again, self-assessment, so I don't even know what it is, that you could improve upon, what would that be? And then they sort of become, well, I could probably, and many times for me, it's stumbling across sugary sweetened beverages, as you've talked about. That's simply eliminating. So I try to focus, rather than on the overwhelming approach to healthy eating, sort of I believe in the sort of single concept learning theory. When you study for finals in college, they didn't give you 3 finals on the same day because it's hard to study for 3 finals. So you got 1 final in chemistry and 1 in English, and you got a couple of days in between. Well, the same thing as someone like me and you who live in this world of multi-risk factor intervention. If you tell someone, you got to take this pill for blood pressure, these 2 pills for your diabetes, this one for your cholesterol, you got to stop smoking and lose 50 pounds, it's not likely that they're going to be successful at anything. But if you stratify the risk based upon what you believe to be their greatest risk, realizing that you have time for this, I sort of tend to focus on what is the most important. And let's assume it's, poor nutrition leading to pre-diabetes and maybe some overweight or obese status. And then we'll focus on that. And by then focusing on that, maybe 3 to 6 months down the road, we'll focus a little bit more on the blood pressure, the cholesterol, or the triglycerides. And I try to make it easy for the patients because that makes it easier for me. If I can get them to follow one simple lifestyle change and one major risk factor that we can move on, I'm happy with that. And I see people at a regular 2 to 3 month interval. And over the course, and I tell them it's going to take 6 months or a year to get to where I'd like you to get to in 3 weeks, but I don't think we're going to be able to do. So, I'm wondering if you, when we do send people to you for the nutritional counseling, whether you sort of try to be totally comprehensive or more sort of singularly and laser focused.
It depends. I mean, I wouldn't try anything. It's the motivational interviewing, right? So it's finding out what's going on with the patient, what's the main thing to work on. But I think you mentioned some key behaviors. So watching, sugar sweetened beverages is a huge one. Just the number, so there's research on just the number of times people eat out. So how many times a week you buy restaurant food. So we always like to focus on like behavior numbers you can track that are not related to the actual scale, because people will jump on the scale and get frustrated, and that creates a pattern of frustration. Versus if you give them numbers to work with. So if you have, X amount of sugar sweetened beverages per day or per week, can we change that by next week? If you buy foods, even if they seem like healthy food places, remember at the end of the day, even like a wonderful salad or vegetable soup can be super high in sodium. It could have extra oil. Just the fact that you're buying restaurant foods is usually one of the measures with like nutrition, diet quality, right? So if you purchase, 7 meals a week, maybe more or less, right? By next week, can we reduce that? So some research shows, trying to only buy foods like 3 or 4 times a week as like a moderate amount, that's reasonable to help you stay on track with your health goals. Because it's just the fact of purchasing food outside. Our portion sizes are, harder to estimate. You don't have control over, the oils and the sodium that go into your food. I think those are like 2 really overarching, indicators.
I think that's a great point you make about eating out versus eating home. And I've had real life experience during the COVID-19 pandemic. We were kidding yesterday about the freshman 15 when you go to college, or the COVID-19 during the pandemic. But much to my surprise, and I've experienced it personally, that I think for every one person who puts on 10 or 15 pounds, or has put on the 10 or 15 pounds during the pandemic, that as many or more people have actually wound up losing weight of an equivalent amount because they're not eating out. Just the nature of the pandemic is the worst. If you really want to guarantee yourself to get COVID-19, go eat out in a restaurant, take off your mask and sit near other people, and I guarantee you'll get COVID. Now, you may wind up losing weight on COVID, but that's obviously not part of the plan. But just the mere fact that people are eating home way more without doing anything else, you just eat less. I always kid my wife, who's a great chef. How come everything, and even though the food she makes at home is wonderful and healthy and tasty and delicious, I always ask her, how come it always tastes better when we eat out? And it's because of salt, sugar, and fat. There's more salt, there's more sugar, there's more fat. You think you're eating healthy, and a piece of salmon and a Ruth's Chris still could be 1,200 or 1,500 calories, dipped in butter, loaded with salt. And it's no longer that 6-ounce piece of salmon that you've cooked with, without butter, without salt,
Right.
without sugar, and still taste delicious at home. So I think that's a huge takeaway. And as we get out of this pandemic that we're all, no pun intended, dying for here, and we go back to our eating out, I do think that there's going to be a lot of benefit to be gained by understanding that the social aspects of eating out are wonderful and we all need, but the health aspects of eating out really put a challenge to your ability to maintain weight. And I see a lot of people who travel who, no matter how diligent they are about how they eat, really find it impossible to eat healthy because so many of their meals are on the run, through the airport, on the airplane, in a meeting, and it just doesn't make for healthy eating.
So you see, like everyone's needs could be different, right? So in those cases of people that it's almost like impossible, they may feel that they can't have this amount of home cooked meals, or at least home prepared, right? You don't always have to be a chef to prepare some foods at home. But it still requires, I always like to advocate for meal planning, even if the planning means that you're going to pick up food. Part of the planning is, you can look online, any chain restaurant with over 20 locations has nutrition facts, even if it's required by it's actually like a federal law, that they have to provide that nutrition information online and in the restaurant. Um, and other non-chain restaurants also do have the nutrition facts. Now I'll, pick and choose that some of them I've caught many errors, but being a dietitian, like I can catch those errors. But at least it helps, in your meal planning, even if you're going to buy food, to be aware. So education, I think, creates awareness for people to, open their eyes of, that healthy bowl, that I was eating was, 1,600 calories, and it was a healthy bowl with whole grains, but who knows the portion sizes, all of the sauces that could go on top, whatever that, healthy bowl was. It's, even if it has healthy ingredients, it's like you said, the fat, sugar, and sodium that restaurant foods can be so high. So I always like to advocate still for meal planning, researching. Even if you're buying foods outside, you can still meal plan.
I think you make another great point that I want to emphasize is the whole meal planning aspect of it, because I always ask people, busy people, they're doing on Sunday night, they look at their calendar, they plan their week, they know what meetings they have, they know where they have to be, what their work is, when they're picking up the kids, who's dropping off at soccer practice. And, you plan, you have to. I mean, we all live in this incredibly busy and stressful life, but what we don't plan is our food and our time to exercise and de-stress. Right. And the second you say that to someone, they say, yeah, I mean, I never do that. That's always the last piece of the day. And that's when, oh my God, I'm hungry. Let me just drive through McDonald's and pick up a 3-minute meal with 1,800 calories and who knows how many grams of sugar, salt, and fat. And that's when all of a sudden, you instead of putting yourself and prioritizing yourself first, you put everyone else first and you prioritize yourself last and you suffer. So I think meal planning is an extraordinarily important part of what I would call those that was what I was sort of aiming at earlier to those important things: eating out less, planning your meals. Maybe I can, as we get ready to close, I know we're getting near time, if you could say something around the timing of eating, because a lot of people come in, now that intermittent fasting has made it into the real world, understanding that intermittent fasting was never a weight loss or healthy approach. It was actually an ability to prolong life. Setting the biological clock. It just turned out that one of the processes in that was that you actually ate more healthy and lost some weight. So I was just wondering what from where you sit in the nutrition world, some comments about timing of eating.
Right. So planning your meals, we'll start with that one and we then talk about fasting, but it's still the traditional breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Think about the word breakfast, it's break fast, you're breaking an overnight fast and feeding your body, when you look at food for what it is, which is part of that educational aspect of, we just have to understand what our food is and how food is fuel, food is nutrition, and why it literally fuels you. You mentioned that at the beginning of the talk of how what we put into our bodies, fuels us. So starting off with breakfast, lunch, and dinner, meal planning, meal timing is important. We're still learning, with the research world of nutrition, of the different impacts. I think the main take-home message is eating according to your circadian rhythm, which is your cycle of waking up and sleeping. So during your wake times, it's kind of like common sense, right? You eat when you're the busiest and when you're awake. But ironically, like you mentioned, when we're so busy is when we skip meals, or that's what we see people do. So just being aware with this, again, I think education is knowledge, is awareness is power, right? That, eating according to your most, when you need it the most. So breakfast, lunch, and dinner helps provide the fuel. Carbohydrates, again, they get attacked, but carbs our brain requires 120 grams of carbohydrate a day just to think, So if I have to prove, some basic concepts of why food is fuel throughout your day, thinking requires energy. And then we hear people complain of, I can't concentrate, or I have a headache. And there's many factors that can determine why people have headaches, right? But as a dietitian, my question is, when was your last meal and what was in that meal? Because if there wasn't any carbs, so I'm just kind of justifying the whole breakfast, lunch, and dinner, especially with a busy lifestyle. Now, when it comes, we talked about it yesterday, that there's some research about, what was the common phrase of?
Breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper.
Something like that, right? So breakfast like a king is what sticks, right? So there's some research about with the same amount of calories, if you just distribute it differently, so the larger amount of calories in the morning, the normal amount midday, and maybe a lighter amount for dinner. Doesn't mean you're skipping dinner, it just means it's a lighter amount compared to breakfast, especially. That may have like favorable, outcomes, but again, we're in the world where most people are skipping breakfast. I'd love to even see people, start having breakfast to start. So, and I think that goes with people that usually have that, wake up and go lifestyle, especially people that are exercising in the morning. It makes sense to have a breakfast like a king, because you burned energy mentally and physically. So all before noon, right? So it always comes down to what's realistic for you to follow. When the terms of fasting, as I was telling Dr. Feldman yesterday, and like he just mentioned right now, fasting traditionally had nothing to do with calorie restriction. It just meant that our bodies technically, when we talk about metabolism, have two different states. We're either in a fed state or a fasting state. So when we're eating our meals, we're fed. But when your body enters fasting states, basically your digestive system and certain enzymes and certain hormones go down while others go up. And that shift has been, like Dr. Feldman just said, favorable for longevity, right? And it makes sense. Think about a car that's running and then all of a sudden a car's off, right? So the car's at rest. So longevity wise, we know like the research is there, but for weight loss, they're very controlled studies is what I find. And I don't think it's always applicable to the common everyday working person, what we see in some of the research about intermittent fasting. So intermittent fasting, usually people are not eating for 16 hours a day, which usually they'll start fasting from dinner time, and the next time they eat is like lunchtime. So I find it like some people usually use it as an excuse of why they skip breakfast. But for the average person, I always like talking about just the overnight fast. Sometimes we forget that sleeping, that's technically your overnight fasting time. Most people are not sleeping enough every night. So if you let your body get the rest it needs, and the regular fasting, right? So 7 to 9 hours of sleeping plus not eating like a king before bedtime, right? So also, with reflux recommendations, avoiding large meals before bedtime, that also helps prove the point of not having too large of a meal too close to bedtime. You can easily fast for 10 to 12 hours without calling it intermittent fasting, right? Just
Right.
as a healthy eating, or healthy lifestyle in general. So.
Okay. I think that's great. So, Maury, Alana, do we have any other questions from the audience? Because I know we're running on time and I want to be sensitive to everyone's time. But this was an awesome discussion, and I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else as well. So, Lucette, thank you so much for really a tremendous overview.
Definitely. I wanted to thank you both for taking the time to do the presentation with us. In the interest of time, we do have one last one that you guys can touch upon, and it
Okay.
says, are fat-free foods better for heart health? Short and sweet, 1 minute.
I'm going to throw it out and say not necessarily. Low fat means high carbs, and if the high carbs are processed carbs with trans fats and high fructose corn syrup, not necessarily a good idea. So you have to be careful. In 1981, when the American Heart Association started to push low fat, our obesity rates was 11%. Now you see low fat everywhere. Our obesity rates are around 40%. So low fat hasn't necessarily been associated with reduction of obesity or diabetes. But Lucette, why don't you wrap it up with that one?
So if it's talking about a package or processed food that has the words fat-free on it, I always recommend just label reading to see what's in that food, because if they reduce fat, yes, like Dr. Feldman says, they usually add some form of sugar or syrup instead of the fat. The only exception I would say, I always think of, there's always exceptions to this, would be with milk. If you're buying low fat or fat-free milk or any dairy product, that's okay, because it's not that it's low fat, it's low saturated fat. So the exception here, I think, would be dairy, because it's definitely good if you can buy low fat or fat free dairy to spare yourself from the saturated fat. So that's it.
Yeah, I mean, generally, when you take out one macronutrient, you have to add in another. So if you're taking out fat, you're adding carbohydrates or protein. So it's, there's only so much. But I think low fat has been a real marketing tool of the food industry that has not necessarily improved the general health of the population.
Agree.
So, okay, back to you, Maury. Thank you, everybody.
No, thank you guys for taking the time to doing this. Great presentation.
Thanks
for having me.
Bye.
Bye-bye.